Welcome CSE 235 to exercise 3 form. We'll just call it form for now. And what we'll be doing is building a form. An HTML form, we'll be styling it with CSS, and then we'll be printing some information to the page using JavaScript. We're not going to process any form information yet. And I did record a video for ex3 form earlier before we started other exercises, but we're getting back to it now. So we're going to go back and do some HTML, some CSS, and then JavaScript. But I just wanted to review this real quick and just to show you a couple things here. We have body, which has a light blue color. We have our form panel, which is a darker blue. It has a little border on it and it has round corners. And then we have class names of labels. Now these are actually labeled for these input fields, but these are class names of labels. So they all have a class name of label, and these all have a class name of field. Now some of these will change a little bit because they're shorter. This one is a button, so they're going to change a little bit, so they'll have more unique names to them. But that's basically what we have. And just to show you how it functions, this is kind of a full size. This form panel is about 50% of the full page, and it has equal space on either side. And then when it gets smaller, it scales, and then at a certain point, it's going to lose some of that margin on the side, like now. See what happened? Now it has less margin. So now it's going to go from 50% to maybe 80%. And there's less margin on either side. It's still centered. And if you keep going, you can see the fields get smaller here. And if we keep going, eventually they're going to become left justified instead of right, and they're each going to be on their own line, so it'll be centered like that. So that's the way it'll look on a phone. So that's what we're working towards, and not just that, we're also going to have the information enter into these fields, and when we hit the submit button, we're going to print it out on the page. So that's what we're going to do in ex3. So coming up, we're going to start this from scratch and start building it and start working with form elements and start using some CSS to kind of align it and set it up so it's responsive. When I show this, this means it's responsive. Full page as it gets smaller and as it eventually shows up on a device with no margin on it. So that's what we're going to start working on. So we can look at form elements on W3 schools just to get an idea of what these are. And we're going to make these all divs just to make them a little bit more flexible when we work with them and have a little more control over them. Instead of putting them in a table, and even instead of using Flexbox for this, we'll just kind of use divs and we'll float them. So let's get started. All right, let's create a new repel. So we're going to create a repel, and we'll use HTML, CSS, JS, and we'll call it CSC 235, and I'll put dash ex3 form and put your initials, CJH, and we're ready to go. All right, as usual, we're going to get rid of everything in here, including the JavaScript right now. We could always put it in later. And we do have style.css. If you want to change this to styles, you could put an S here, and you could rename this and put an S there. If you prefer, you could leave it style, and we'll change our title. We'll call it ex3 form. You could put your initials. We're going to start building a form, and we're going to do it inside a body. And the first thing we'll do is we'll create a form panel. So we'll make a class called form panel, and then we'll put something in it. So this isn't a formal element yet. We're just going to hit return here, and it'll just be a div. So we could just say div dot, and we'll just call it form dash panel. So again, a div is just like an area. And I'll hit tab, and it gives that class name a form panel, and I'll open that up, and this is where a form's going to go. So let's make a form element, and let's check out W3 schools. And if you go to HTML, you could go all the way down on the left side and check out HTML forms and read about it. Check it out. It's about they're used for collecting user input, and they have some triad things here. And the basic form element won't have any attributes to start. And they talk about the different elements here: input type text, input type radio, checkbox, submit button. There's also text area. There's also select that has different option values. And we also use something called a label element that actually creates a label for them, so you don't have to physically make a label that's on them. So they'll be linked up, And it's very important to note that the for attribute of the label tag should be equal to the ID attribute of input. So in addition to being important for JavaScript, the ID is also important for the for attribute of the label tag. So we're going to use something called label for, and that way it'll link up to that particular input text field. And radio buttons, blah, blah, blah. We'll kind of go through this later. But here you can see they'll have different attributes. The type might be radio, it might be text, it might have an ID, it might have a name, it might even have a value. So we're going to be talking about all of that. First form attribute that we'll talk about is the action attribute. This is the one that will usually send it to a different page. We're not going to do that right now, but we could still put in a form action, and we could put in like a pound sign just to kind of have it react, but we're not actually going to send the form right now. And also an on submit might submit the button from there, but this is where we're going to start right now with a form inside our panel. So let's go back and create a form. So I'll just put form and I'll hit tab. And it is already asking for action, and I'll just put in a pound sign for now. And we'll put everything inside our form. So again, we're going to start with labels. We could put a heading in it if we want, but we're just going to start with some labels, and it's just going to be address, first name, last name, street name, and so on. So let's start there. And let's make an input field. We'll put input, I'll hit tab, type equals text, and we'll give it an ID name, we'll give it a name, and we'll just put name equals F name, that'll be first name, and then we'll give an ID equals F name. They can be the same, and we'll start with that. Let's run it. There it is. Pretty nice. And we're going to have a label for it. So that's why we have an ID name. So before that, let's put label, type label, hit tab, and it already does the label, and the for attribute is going to be what? It's going to be the ID name. So it's going to be F name. And inside these label tags, you have to put what the label says. So the label is going to say like first name, and you can put a colon at the end. There it is. So I'm just running it here. We're obviously going to open it up in a new tab, but we're just running it right here just to get a start. So that's what we have, first name. So obviously we'll have a bunch like that, and then we're going to style how each one goes. What we'll also do is give special class names to each of these. Now, one thing I want to point out before we give them class names, we could just give them class names and we could say float one aside of the other, but right now these are not block elements. They go side by side. You see they went here side by side. That might look okay for now, but if we want to stack them, how do we stack them? You can't just say, oh, just stack them. You'd have to have a line break or a paragraph return or something. So we want to make sure they're block elements. That way we'll have more control over stacking them or using a float or something else to put them side by side. So what I'm going to do now, even though this is more work, we'll have more control. We're going to wrap divs around these, and then we're going to style the divs with the label, the actual input field, and the actual label inside of them, because then we'll have more control. So let's do that now. We could have started to do that, but I just wanted to point that out. So we are going to put divs around them. It is going to make a lot more code, because you're going to be like, wow, why are we doing so much more code? Can't we just give them a class name, you know, like class label? And I'm actually going to take this out because I started to do that and I don't want to do that right now. So I'm not going to do the class names in here. I'm actually going to create a div with the class names so that we could kind of control them a little bit more as block elements. So the block element will be a div with a label inside, a block element with an input inside. That way we'll have more control over putting them on their own line, separating them, moving them, working with margin, all that kind of stuff. So let's just make sure everything's okay here. Let me just run it one more time. And I think what I'll do is I'll open this up in a new window so that we have a little more coding space. So I'll open this up and I'll basically move this over here. I could leave a little room, but I don't want to have our code wrapping too much. So what I'll do now is I'll make a div. So we're going to wrap a div around each one. Now again, this is more work, and usually what I'll do is I'll just put div and I'll put a class name, and you could just use dot, and we'll just call it label. Now I know we have a label element, but I'll just call the class name label because it'll have a dot. So I'll put div label, be kind of a general class name for all the labels, and I'll hit tab. So now it's div class equals label. Now I want to wrap that around. I'll cut the closing one and wrap that around the label, and that means I want to indent this, so I'll tab that over. And then I want to do the same thing here. So again, you can see it's going to make a lot more code, especially when we have a lot of fields here, but I'll put div dot. Now this one we'll just call field, kind of a general term. And then we're going to style them. And I'll hit tab. So same thing, cut the div, put it after this, paste it, line things up so that when you do everything else, you have a nice kind of system and structure set up. So I'm going to indent that. It just helps to follow what's going on here. So every label is going to kind of look like this. Now that's a lot more code, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code for each label, but we'll have a lot more control over that later. And we'll be able to target the label class, we'll be able to target the field class, and then we may even be able to target the label class, the label inside it, the input inside that class if we need to do something else for just the field itself and not the whole div. Because making the div longer doesn't always make the field longer. So we'll make some of those adjustments as we work with it. But that's the first thing. And then we're just gonna, let's just copy this whole thing again. I'll just copy it. And the next one is going to be last name, so that'll be an easy one. I'll put L name, and I'll make this last, and I'll make everything L here. ID L. And it'll be the same class. So remember, we can reuse classes because that'll just be the way all the fields are set up. So we have first name, last name, and we're just doing an address, so we could just do street. So let me just paste it one more time. And this field will be street, street, and the label will be street. And I think we used number, apartment, something like that. We could keep doing that because you might have that. So we'll copy that. And actually, I don't want to copy it. I want to copy, remember, we're copying both. So copy the label and the field so we have them together. Copy and then paste. And then right away, before you get too confused, you can see that the code's getting a little more harder to deal with. You could put in HTML comments to help you see things a little bit better. But before I do anything else, I'll just call this number. I'll put number here. I'll put number, and you could abbreviate or whatever. So let's just make sure we have everything. So again, the classes stay the same. The only thing that's changing is number 4, we're using the ID name. So make sure they match up. Label 4 has to match up with the ID. Don't go in here and call this num or anything like that. So it's going to be number. So they're all the same for now. So we have first name, last name, street, number, and then we could put city, and that'll be a fill-in kind of thing using an input text. So we'll do one for city, and we'll do something for state. Now for state, it's going to be a little bit different. So let's just do, I'll kind of space this out here, and I'll paste it one more time. I'll copy this one more time. This one is going to be zip. We'll have a zip that they'll have to put in, just called zip. So for ID name, zip, we have everything zip here. Now what's going to go here, and remember, if you want to do a comment, I'll just put state dropdown just so we know what's here. And if you're unsure of the HTML comments, just highlight it and do command ? And if that doesn't work, I've heard some people say it's not working well on Windows, you're always going to do this. Here, I'll just do this, a less than sign, and then 2 dashes. And you can see everything is green now, and then start typing. I'll just put state dropdown, and then make sure you finish it off, or else it won't stop all of the commenting from continuing. So it doesn't know where to stop, so it's commenting everything. You don't use the exclamation point again, you just use dash dash and arrow. And like I said, you could highlight and try the command /. So everything below here is going to be a state dropdown. So that's going to be what's called a select menu. So let's look at that. Let's go to W3 Schools. I don't have it open anymore. Go to HTML, run down here to forms, and we'll look at input types. Radio, checkbox, date. We want something called select to make a drop-down menu. And we're not seeing it as an input type because it really isn't an input type. So let's look at form elements here. And let's check out the select one because that's what we're going to use. So it's not an input, it's a select. So let's see if we could find select. Here it is under form element. So we were checking under input and it's not there. So the way this works, and I'll just go here to try it yourself of this little thing here. Basically, it has a select of what it is. That's the main menu, just like a zip or address or anything else. But then we have these option values in here. And so it's a little more complicated. And it's going to look like that. Here's some cars. And we're just going to put in some states. We're not going to put a whole list of states. We're just going to put a couple right now. We could put a whole list of states. And there's even a way we can make an array of states and have JavaScript kind of populate this. We'll show how to do that. One of our students was doing that in his own thing when we did that earlier with the date. I think he put all the dates in a drop-down list and had JavaScript do that. So we can do that. But for now, we'll just learn how to do it the old-fashioned way. And then if we need to make that faster, since there's 50 states we might want to have, we'll just put a couple states close by. But again, we're going to have select, and it'll have an ID, and it'll have a name, and then we'll have option values. Now, they don't have IDs and names or anything like that. They just have values of what's actually going to show up in the list. So the main kind of input, really, even though it's not called input, is going to be the select and then the option value. So it's kind of like a list where you have the unordered list and then you have list items. So it's kind of like that. If you want to copy some of this or even just type it in, let's type it in. Let's get used to that. So I'm going to put select and see what happens when we hit tab. Now it's asking for a name and we're going to put state, and it's asking for an ID and we're going to put state. And there's going to be elements inside of select. So make sure you hit return here. And then we'll put our option values in here. And let's see if we could put option, and I'll hit tab. Now, one thing I didn't do yet, we still want to put a label for it. So let's do this whole label thing. Div class label, copy that and paste it there. And it's going to be label for state. And it's going to say state, because we're still going to have a label for state. We could tab this in, and then we could tab that in more. That's a lot of tabbing. I don't know if it's that necessary to do all that tabbing, but we'll do that. We'll stay with what we were doing, and label for state. Remember, ID has to match up, and I'll move this over so it's lined up. Now we have these option values. Now, what states do we want to use? Let's take a look here. Let's take a look. Now they have just the first one there. Now you could put one that says select if you want. So we could do that. You can make another one that says select. Other than just having the first state in the list. So you could do option value select. You could do that. And then we'll copy that and put one that says New Jersey. Have one that says PA, and we'll put one that says New York. What else is close by? I don't know. Maryland, kind of close by. Delaware, whatever. Well, there's Delaware. I'll put DE, and then I'll put Maryland. So all these kind of close states to us right here, bordering kind of states of where we're at, New Jersey. And those are the values. So that looks like it's set up. So we have our select element, and we have our label for a select element. Now let's just see what this looks like. I mean, we could run it over here and just look, and that's okay for now. And let's look at it this way. And you can see nothing showing up here right now. So it should be showing up in there. Let's see what we did wrong in there. Might have did something wrong. Option value, and what did we do wrong? Let's look at this, because this is where the problem is. There's nothing showing up in these things. Can you see what we did wrong? Well, there's nothing in between here. If we look at these things, they have the actual value, just like a label. You have to have the value in there. So the value is what it is what's going to get sent somewhere. But what's showing up in the select menu is this stuff. So that has to be regular text in there. So let's make sure we put that in. So all this stuff has to be repeated. So you could just put it there without quotes and copy NJ. And you could spell out New Jersey, and then it gets sent as NJ, whatever. And then it would get sent as NJ, but we'll just put them the same right now. Because if it goes in a database, probably going to use the 2-letter abbreviation anyway. I'll backspace this a little bit. Don't want to backspace that. I'll go here, backspace that. I don't need space in between here. But you can see that helps a little bit. It's still a lot of code to deal with. And using those divs, like I said, adds a lot more code, but we'll have more control over it because they're block elements. Then we could put them side by side. We could just say, hey, every label float to the left of a field, and we'll be able to do that. So we'll be able to change the layout. So right now they're all block elements because they're divs, and now we could put them side by side. We can change the width of them. We could change the percent of how they show up on a page. We haven't done anything with the form panel yet. We have it, but we haven't done anything yet. So we have the basic form, I believe. Let me just double check. Okay, so here's the video. I had to go look at the video because I didn't want to open up another repel or anything. But we just need a submit button. And remember, we won't have a label for the submit button. And I think last time I used input for that. I used an input type submit, but we could just use a button. So let's just go use a button, and then we'll look at what works better, whether we use a button, whether we use an input. So we'll go back here, and I'll move this over. And the last thing we'll need before our form element ends, which is right here, and we'll still put a label and a label for. So I'm actually going to highlight everything here for the zip and paste and just move that out. And this will be div class equals label, and this will be label for submit. And we don't have anything for submit yet, but we can put button and give it an ID of submit and hit tab. So button with an ID of submit, and we have the label for that's going to be before it, but we actually want to put something on the button, so we have to put submit here. So I'll put it in all caps like that. So a button element will have that. So div class equals field button ID equals submit, and I'm not sure if we need anything else yet. We'll see what else we need, and let's just look at it. And that's good. We have it says zip. We don't want it to say zip. So the label should say what? Nothing. We don't want anything for the label right now. So that's going to be blank. So we're just going to leave that blank right now. Nothing inside the label, but we may want to control it a little bit. So we won't put anything inside there. So let's just leave it empty for now. And actually, that's how we want it. That looks fine for now. The state is working side by side. That's what I noticed. And is it because we don't have a div? We don't. We have a label for... Oh, I see what we don't have. We don't have a closing div for the label. So let's just put a closing div. So we have a closing div for the label. And then this could be field. We may change this. We may do something, give it a different name. But for now, let's just put div.field. And we'll treat it as a field, even though technically it's not a field, but we'll put that around the select element. And we'll put that like that. So now let's just check it out. And that's the way it should look. Everything should be stacked. So even state should be on top of select, even though we don't want it to look like this. But we want to keep the structure the same, where we have class of field, and it's wrapped around everything that's going to be in that particular field, which is the main label and the drop downs. And I think we have everything okay so far. So this is where we're at after part one. So what we're going to do next is dig into the CSS. So that probably wasn't a lot of fun, especially with all this div stuff. You know, that's where HTML gets a little, you know, not fun doing all that. Once you take the time and get it right the first time, we're doing it so we have a little more control over things. So all that extra work with the divs, you know, obviously there's more chances of making mistakes, and I forgot a div tag, and even just with the select area, that became a little bit of a problem here because I didn't have the closing div around the label and then a class of field, and should this be field or should it be something else, because it won't be as long as some of the other ones, and so on. But we'll deal with that when we start working with the CSS. So we'll start building it up to make it start to look like this with color. So we'll do that in part 2. So thanks for your patience in part 1.